Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fifth Share Your Green Design Masterclass. Share Your Green Design is a digital ecosystem of exemplary case studies, research, methodologies, and ideas that showcase sustainable architectural design from around the world. Our mission is to substantially reduce the industry's carbon footprint by providing architects, engineers, and all construction professionals with the knowledge that they need. Masterclass is a space where we invite top experts on very specific topics related to sustainability in the built environment, decarbonization, health and well-being in buildings, and much more. Today, our special guest is Anna Marojani. Anna is Professor of Sustainable, Healthy, and Equitable Built Environment at the Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering from the Bartlett, UCL. For more than 15 years, Anna has carried out interdisciplinary research on indoor environmental quality, overheating risk, and climate impacts on health at the building and the urban scale, focusing on vulnerable populations and inequalities. She has led work on the quantification of climate change impacts on UK housing, heating, and cooling needs as part of the Climate Services for a Net Zero World project and the Advancing School Performance, Indoor Environmental Quality, Resilience, and Educational Outcomes project. She's a co-investigator in the NERC Climate Care project, investigating the climate resilience of the UK care homes and the Clean Air Network health and equity impacts of climate change mitigation measures on indoor and outdoor air pollution exposure, where she leads the Energy Career Researcher Group. She's a member of the CIPSI Knowledge Management Committee and co-secretary of the IBPSA England Board. During this masterclass, Anna will present evidence on current indoor environmental performance of buildings occupied by vulnerable people such as homes, care homes, and schools, and discuss the relatively effectiveness of potential solutions towards their improvement under the current and future climate. Synergies and conflicts between environmental sustainability and health, comfort, and well-being targets in the context of net zero will be discussed. So, as usual, we'll have a Q&A session after the presentation, so please post all your comments and questions in the chat, and we will go through as many as we can. And last but not least, we will be recording this session and we'll post it later in our channels for your review. So, over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Bethania. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to be here in such a great initiative and resource. Hopefully the presentation is now full screen. So what I'd like to talk about today is how we design, how do we optimize our designs of indoor climates for a future climate in the context of the climate crisis, but also increased awareness about the health and well-being impacts of indoor air pollution. So next slide, please. Thank you. So as many of our listeners probably know, there is growing concern about the negative impacts of both indoor overheating and poor air quality in buildings across building stocks around the world, including in temperate climates such as the UK. So it is a nationwide growing problem that can have adverse effects for health, well-being, comfort, productivity, and also in particular with regards to overheating. It can render buildings uninhabitable during summer months. It affects different actors in society. It affects the construction industry, building designers, retrofit providers, contractors, businesses. It can cause a lot of disruption in terms of how habitable the indoor environments are and how several businesses operate. Social housing stocks might be particularly affected, social landlords. Of course, it poses a significant burden on the health and social care sector, which, as we know, are already negatively affected post-COVID-19 pandemic. It also has impacts for building owners, occupiers, renters, and most importantly, it will affect disproportionately the most vulnerable in society. So what I hope to do in this presentation is go through some of the causes for these effects, and then discuss some solutions, what can be done for different building types and different sets of so for different population groups. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in a lot of the work we do at the UCL Institute for Environmental Design Engineering, where I'm based, we define building envelopes as modifiers of environmental exposures. So what do I mean by this? In recent years, there have been increased levels of awareness about the impacts that climate change, and ambient air pollution can have on our health and well-being. And this is great because we see more research, more policy interest in these areas. What we see perhaps less, or where there is perhaps less understanding, is the importance of the indoor environment. Having said that, again, the COVID pandemic in some ways has highlighted the importance of indoor environments, our workplaces, our homes, for health and well-being. So we have seen a small increase there, but I think there are still lots of evidence and knowledge gaps. So why do we care about indoor environments? Well, it is estimated that in climates such as the UK, temperate or heating-dominated climates, people spend 90% of their time indoors. So quite a significant part of our day is spent within homes, workplaces, learning environments, retail spaces, etc. So, and this is likely to be much higher for vulnerable individuals, people who have a limited mobility, for example, or are socially isolated. And what we do know, as the diagram at the top shows, is that every building envelope will modify exposures to a series of environmental variables: temperature, humidity, air pollution, light, etc. So building envelopes function as filters, if you'd like, as modifiers of those environmental exposures. And then on the other hand, we also have a series of environmental quality factors, such as heat or internal heat gains or air pollutants generated indoors. So a lot of the work we do is about really the balance between internally generated and externally generated environmental factors, and how the buildings act as modifiers of the associated exposures. Importantly, building stocks in countries such as the UK are not prepared to cope with warmer weather, so they have essentially been designed for a fixed climate, for very different climatic conditions, and in many ways are maladapted to warmer weather. And of course, this is very problematic because, as we know, our climate is changing and they need to be resilient for a wide range of climatic conditions, whilst at the same time promoting high indoor environmental quality, so low levels of indoor air pollutants, sufficient access to daylight, etc. Next slide, please. So why is this important? So this is a paper led by my colleague, Dr. Yorgos Petru, that we published a while ago at the BMJ on net zero current energy efficiency targets and what this means for indoor air. And this paper really highlights the need we have to monitor indoor air, to understand a little bit more what those existing net zero targets mean for our indoor environments. So I would like to clarify that we currently have, there is an imperative to reduce the space heating needs and associated carbon emissions from our building stock in a heating-dominated climate such as the UK and elsewhere. And this is absolutely fundamental in the context of climate change mitigation strategies. However, single-focus policies can have unintended consequences. So energy efficiency strategies that don't adopt a whole systems approach can be detrimental for indoor environmental quality. And an example of this is increasing the building fabric airtightness or insulation levels of building stocks without simultaneously thinking about ventilation rates, strategies, or summer thermal performance, passive cooling strategies, and so on. So energy efficiency measures, trying to achieve those net zero targets, but without relying on high thermal insulation air tightness levels, but without thinking about year-round performance or indoor air quality can be quite problematic. And the diagram at the bottom kind of visually illustrates the relationship between air changes in a building and pollutant concentration indoors. And I think the issue there is that when previously we had quite a leaky and not very airtight building stock, we had those unintended air change pathways. So indoor air quality relied in some ways on those unintended air change pathways, but these will be diminished as we make our buildings more airtight. So what does this mean? We might be protected from the ingress of external pollutants possibly, but if we have high levels of internally generated pollutants or heat generated indoors, these will be trapped inside the building and therefore increase the exposure of the occupants to both heat and pollutants. And this can possibly have adverse health effects. So this is very much the balance that we're interested in, again, in the context of net zero and a changing climate. Next slide, please. So what are the causes of poor indoor environmental quality? So I think I've already mentioned a few of them, but I'll just go through that list because it has been described by colleagues as a kind of toxic cocktail, a perfect storm of interacting factors. Next slide. So first and foremost, anthropogenic climate change, as probably all of our listeners are aware, we're facing a climate breakdown, an unprecedented challenge for our built environment and communities and economies. And in countries such as the UK, we already experience, because climate change is ongoing, wetter and windier winters, but importantly, drier and much warmer summers. And these are some headlines there from the recent heat wave of 2022, 40 degrees heat wave in London. It exceeded a lot of predictions, climate change projections in many ways. And I guess that was a taster of future climates that we will be increasingly experiencing in the future. It has been estimated that summer heat waves of the magnitude of the 2003 heat wave, which also caused lots of deaths, excess deaths, and economic losses, this type of event will have become common by the 2050s, by the middle of the century. Next slide, please. At the same time, in urban environments, those background warming effects will be exacerbated by urbanization trends and urban heat island effects. Urban heat island intensity is defined as the differential between core urban and rural areas. And it's the effect of inadvertent local climate modification due to the urban morphology and also anthropogenic heat produced through various activities, buildings, industry, etc. So these existing overheating risks that are induced by climate change can potentially be magnified by heat island effects in cities around the world. Next slide, please. And then at the same time, when we look at the building sector, we have, again, another combination of potential risk factors, contributors to poor indoor environmental quality. So as I said earlier, our buildings tend to be optimized for past climate. In the UK, buildings, in particular homes, they were designed in such a way that maximized the absorption of solar heat gains. So lack of shading, lack of more effective cooling solutions, etc. At the same time, to mitigate climate change and meet those net zero targets, we are setting winter energy efficiency targets. And the reason why I'm putting winter in parentheses there is that we tend to speak a lot about energy efficiency, but we always refer to winter energy performance of buildings. However, if we see an increased uptake of air conditioning or other active cooling systems in the future, then we will have to talk about summer energy efficiency. So overheating is not only a thermal comfort issue, it should really be seen as an energy issue as well, because it will have to be dealt with potentially through active systems in the future. So a lot of focus on winter energy efficiency targets, and perhaps less emphasis on summer thermal performance of buildings. The service design in dwellings, the fact that in many cases we're shifting away from the paradigm of naturally ventilated buildings with some active heating in winter, moving towards more engineered buildings, for example, the introduction of MVHR, etc. So this leads to very different environments, and quite often occupants are not necessarily prepared to operate in those different environments. They don't necessarily have the information, the education in order to change their habits, the ways they inhabit those buildings and operate them in an optimum way. In some cases, building conversions can be a problem as well. I'm currently part of a project led by the Bartlett School of Planning, where we're looking at the impact of deregulation on performance of housing. So residential settings that are in buildings that have been converted from other functions, such as they might have been previously offices or warehouses or workplaces, etc. So these buildings were not initially designed for residential use, and this might have some repercussions when that conversion occurs. For example, they might have high levels of glazing, etc. They might be located close to a very busy road. So what are the impacts of increasing the number of converted buildings in the stock for indoor environmental quality? In urban settings, again, naturally ventilated buildings, or relying a lot on natural ventilation for cooling purposes, might have some limitations because again, there might be concerns about pollution, security, noise. So a lot of those strategies that we typically suggest, they might not be feasible in these environments. Safety might be another concern when you're in a high-rise building, and this can counteract with a high urban heat island intensity. So where you need cooling or ventilation the most, is it might be where you might have all those additional barriers. At the same time, there's always a drive to reduce construction costs, and additional nice to have elements such as shading might not be included in the final design. Lack of technical skills in the market, it has been pointed out by many colleagues that we need upskilling in order to achieve net zero energy retrofit. And to some extent, the limitations of the current regulatory framework. So we had Parto introduced a while ago, but unfortunately it doesn't cover all building types. So it's really important that it's a great starting point, but we need to have additional building regulations covering the mitigation of overheating risk. And just to say there, the graph on the right shows a conventional house where indeed that relied on those unintended uncontrolled air change paths, and then a more recently highly insulated, highly airtight building, and you can see that the pathways of airflow are very different. So we really need to build tight but also ventilate right. Next slide, please. And last but not least, there is also the social and cultural lack of knowledge about heat and also air quality. And again, this is something that has been pointed out by colleagues, social scientists who work in this area of risk communication, and also policymakers. That there is a lot of scaremongering, if you'd like, sometimes in the news. You see headlines about the risks of, say, an upcoming heat wave, but these headlines, they're usually accompanied by images of a very nice beach with happy people smiling, having picnics, etc. So that doesn't really help in terms of increasing awareness about the risks associated with heat exposure. So I still think there is a lot of work to be done in understanding the best ways for risk communication, in particular when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable in society. Next slide, please. I thought I would also like add this slide here, just to have that juxtaposition that on the one hand we have climate breakdown, and on the other hand we have an increase in the interest in well-being, wellness, healthy buildings, healthy cities, which I think is great. And in fact, we have established an MSc program back in 2017 in health, well-being and sustainable buildings. But there is a risk, I think, that this becomes a buzzword and it doesn't go in depth, and sometimes it might not necessarily cover all parts of the population. So there is a question there: whose wellness are we studying, and how? Who is represented in the relevant studies? And this is a collage of images from Google, from a Google search I did a while ago, and you can see that the pictures that emerge are a very specific population group, shall we say. So who is represented in these studies and these efforts, initiatives to improve, to make our buildings healthier and our cities healthier? So something there to think about. Next slide, please. So I guess this leads me to discuss climate and health inequalities and inequities. So that drawing there, I think it's excellent because it really shows the differences between reality, what we often see in reality, huge inequalities in the built environment, exacerbated by socioeconomic inequalities, equality, equity, and justice. So I think the message for people working in the built environment sector, either in practice or in research, is that what we need to identify is hazards, vulnerabilities, and the way people are exposed to those hazards and how their vulnerabilities might increase their risks, and then develop the solutions, adopt a solution-oriented approach to mitigate those risks and create an equitable built environment. And the graph there on the right is quite powerful, I think, showing the countries with the highest vulnerability to climate change having the lowest CO2 emissions. So, as we often say, countries or population groups contributing the least to climate change being disproportionately affected or not being sufficiently prepared to cope and recover from climate events. Next slide, please. So that really led to an increase in my own personal interest in the role of vulnerability and the role of the built environment in perpetuating or creating inequities and inequalities with regards to climate change and health, as well as other environmental exposures such as air pollution. So this is a graph from an IPCC report, and I think it very nicely illustrates the different types, dimensions of inequality, and how they can possibly interact and intersect to affect people's vulnerability to climate change, and how this relates to capacities and opportunities. So multidimensional vulnerability is driven by intersecting dimensions of inequality, and this could include gender, class, ethnicity, age, race, disability, but there might also be temporary types of vulnerability, such as being pregnant. And vulnerability increases when people's capacities and opportunities to adapt to climate change are diminished. And just to say that during the pandemic, we also saw a lot of parallels between climate risk and risk to COVID. And again, the pandemic really shed light into how systemic inequalities can increase somebody's risk of poor health. Next slide, please. So inequalities in the built environment underlie key health inequalities. The graph there is from a paper by Dr. Lauren Ferguson, which demonstrates how mean outdoor PM2.5 concentrations vary as a function of area deprivation in London. Again, quite a striking image. So I think it's really important to map those exposures and overlay them with information about socioeconomic characteristics, adaptive capacity, etc., but also built environment characteristics, because our buildings, as I was saying earlier, they're modifiers of those exposures. So they play a very significant role in determining those health impacts. Next slide, please. So impacts of indoor overheating, briefly, the impacts of overheating can be assessed with respect to a number of factors. So these include thermal comfort and well-being, productivity, and this can include work productivity. We know that overheating could potentially lead to poor sleep and subsequently possibly accidents. Health impacts, including morbidity and mortality, but also, as I was saying earlier, energy use and carbon emissions, especially when high levels of overheating risk lead to the adoption of active cooling systems such as air conditioning. Next slide, please. But thermal discomfort is a negative impact in its own right. So over prolonged periods, as I said earlier, it can lead to more serious health impacts, but it can also cause indirectly sleep loss, so poor sleep quality or a reduction in sleep duration, and that can lead indirectly to additional health impacts or reduction in cognitive performance and so on. So for an individual, thermal comfort depends on a number of factors, and this can be physical, temperature, airspeed, humidity, behavioral factors such as our metabolic activity levels or our clothing levels, psychological factors, levels of acclimatization or thermal comfort expectations, and importantly, social factors such as social norms, everyday habits, practices. And I think this is where some of the dangers lie when you have a previously heating-dominated climate society where people are not necessarily prepared. They don't have the social norms or the habits, or they don't necessarily intuitively know what's best in terms of reducing their heat exposure during a heat event. Next slide, please. So it's really important that, of course, we mitigate climate change through existing net zero targets, but at the same time, climate change mitigation is combined with climate change adaptation and resilience. Because maladaptation to a warming climate, for example, through the uncontrolled uptake of active cooling air conditioning, before having prioritized passive cooling measures, can lead to the uncontrolled increase of carbon emissions and, of course, operational costs. So in England, current estimates, I think, suggest that the uptake of domestic air conditioning is around I've seen between 3 and 5%, but that might have been a while ago. So it's likely to have increased. And if this is combined with aggressive air conditioning marketing, we might potentially see a very rapid uptake. And of course, active cooling systems definitely have their place, and they should be prioritized, I think, especially for vulnerable people in the context of cool rooms in a neighborhood or cool spaces. I think they're very important. But where possible, I think it's really important that we also prioritize passive cooling solutions, low carbon solutions, because these have still the potential to reduce the overall cooling loads. Next slide, please. And why this is important? Well, because those systems also have a cost, an operational cost associated with their operation. So this is likely to potentially lead to increases in summer poverty rates. So we talk a lot about winter fuel poverty and how this could increase in the future, but summer fuel poverty is also likely to become a significant issue as our climate becomes warmer. So who is affected most during a heat event? So this includes people above 65 years of age. There is a very well-established relationship in epidemiological literature. People who are chronically ill, suffering from chronic conditions, and this can include cardiovascular, respiratory, or mental conditions. And importantly, socially deprived population groups in inner cities. Social isolation can be a risk factor as well, which is so important that, during a heat wave, we do look after our neighbors, especially if they're older, if we know they suffer from certain conditions, if we know that they live alone. And just to mention that graph there is from a very interesting study we did a few years ago in collaboration with the Technical University of Madrid, where we tried to overlay those different layers, those different information layers, such as urban heat island intensity, income, the proportion of older people in a neighborhood, and also the quality of the building fabric. That's not shown there, but we were overlaying all of these data sets that suggest that all these factors that could potentially increase somebody's vulnerability to heat, to identify the hotspots across the cities where possibly public health interventions should be prioritized. But I think what's also interesting is to see how those maps can change due to warming trends. Next slide, please. Importantly, most heat health studies at the moment tend to focus on the general population. So most epidemiological literature will look at a city or an entire country to develop those heat health relationships. But at the individual level, there are also some evidence gaps around the impacts of heat on specific temperature-sensitive populations. An example of this is people with neuropsychiatric conditions. So a few years ago, I initiated collaboration with colleagues, neurologists at UCL, who have an interest in how people living with epilepsy can be affected by heat. So according to a survey by the Epilepsy Society, more than 60% of people with uncontrolled seizures experience an increase in the seizure activity during periods of unusually hot weather. It might be safe to assume that, to hypothesize that climate change might worsen their health and the frequency of those seizures through different mechanisms. And this again could be indirectly through lack of sleep and so on. So there is still a lot we don't know about these relationships, and there are existing knowledge gaps, in particular with regards to whether it's the magnitude of heat exposure, of temperatures they're exposed to, or the rate of increase. So we are really starting to investigate those relationships further through a number of ongoing collaborations. But yeah, a lot of gaps in our knowledge at the moment, also around the optimum heat protection solutions for these people with limited thermal adaptive capacity. Next slide, please. And in terms of indoor air pollution, I just thought again briefly mention the principal pollutants that we find in indoor air that have known or probable adverse effects on health. So this could be generated from a number of activities, daily activities at home, including cooking, combustion appliances, smoking, volatile organic compounds emitted from building materials, furnishings, cleaning, personal hygiene products. Again, a lot of this is behavior related, and a lot of knowledge gaps still exist with regards to the health impacts of our exposure to those pollutants, radon, mold, etc. Next slide, please. So I'd now like to take you through some research studies that myself and colleagues have been involved in a number of buildings that are or tend to be occupied by vulnerable individuals. So this includes homes, care homes, and schools. So homes, a recent study by Arup estimate that around 90% of the existing homes in the UK will overheat under a 2 degrees global warming scenario. As I was saying earlier, unfortunately, our housing stock is not well prepared to cope with warmer temperatures. And I do think that adapting the stock to mitigate the effects of climate change, so improving its energy efficiency, its airtightness, but also while maintaining good indoor air quality, can have net health benefits in terms also of reducing excess mortality due to heat and cold and reducing fuel poverty. But these need to be combined. Mitigation and adaptation need to go hand in hand. And I definitely think that insulation and air tightness, they shouldn't be seen as a scapegoat for poor quality or overheating. It's simply the result of holistic thinking around design. If we see those issues in newly built, more energy efficient, more airtight homes. Next slide, please. So this is from a study we did where we used a housing stock modeling approach to simulate the housing stock in West Midlands. And we evaluate a series of energy efficiency retrofit and overheating mitigation strategies. So the graph there shows a number of interventions to the housing stock, a number of energy retrofit measures, and different ventilation strategies, but also the introduction of shutters, external shading. So what we found was that a full energy retrofit package reduced domestic space heating quite significantly, but there was a small increase in summertime heat mortality. So because of that trapping of heat indoors, we saw a negative effect on summer heat health. However, when this was combined with external shading, shutters in particular, we saw a decrease in heat mortality. So it's really important, again, that climate change mitigation, net zero interventions are combined with climate change adaptation measures. Next slide, please. So this is also related to this work, and there we can see the box plots demonstrating the distributions for different scenarios. The baseline, the one with the retrofit, full retrofit, then the additional shutters on the baseline, and then the combined energy retrofit and shutters option. So what we conclude from this study was that adequate post-retrofit ventilation, target installation of shutters, ensuring openable windows can save energy and at the same time reduce any adverse heat health effects in the summer. Again, I think that very clearly visualizes those relationships and how important it is to look at the whole year performance of the building stock. Next slide, please. So this is again a housing stock modeling study where we looked at overheating as well as pollutant infiltration. So what we saw is something that corroborates the findings of previous modeling and monitoring studies in this area. Top floor flats, bungalows, newly built airtight dwellings were found to be the most vulnerable to overheating. But what I found quite interesting was that relationship between indoor air quality as a function of levels of exposure of a building to the external climate and ambient air pollution. So in rural areas, in rural dwellings, there were higher levels of indoor pollution from outdoor sources, so essentially higher ingress of externally generated pollutants, and that is probably quite an intuitive result because you have larger, more detached homes there, so higher levels of pollutant infiltration, also as a function of wind speed and so on. Whereas urban dwellings, who tended to be we had more flats, and those homes tended to be much more sheltered with less exposed facades. This had a higher level of internally generated pollutants. So yeah, this is something to keep in mind. That again, there's no one size fits all approach. Location, the local microclimate and building type, the levels of exposure, massing orientation, all of these factors can play a very significant role on indoor environmental quality alongside any energy retrofit or other retrofit measures. Next slide, please. So moving on now to care homes, I'm very lucky to be part of a project funded by NERC, led by Professor Mike Davis at UCLA, funded by NERC. And we identified that knowledge gap at the time, that there wasn't much data out there, or a strong evidence base on the climate resilience or overall thermal performance of care settings. And this is really important because the UK has an aging population, with lots of older people over 65 residing in care homes, and existing literature in this area has identified care settings as a place where we might see adverse health effects during heat waves. However, at the same time, there is a number of heat management challenges in care settings, and these are quoted in the Climate Change Risk Assessment 3. So these include lack of awareness or confusion around responsibility in terms of how to manage building systems to cope with overheating. Again, similarly to homes, care homes are not well prepared to cope with extreme heat. A lot of them are converted. So lack of awareness of risks, but also lack of specific responsibilities of poor governance when it comes to heat management. Lack of existing passive or even active, in some cases, strategies. And possibly diversity in thermal comfort perceptions between residents and staff. Staff tend to be younger, possibly, or healthier, much more active, whereas residents, they might be perceived as vulnerable, but there is what we call a culture of warmth, where staff perceive residents as having the need to be kept warm at all times. That cold means old. So this and that, combined with the limited awareness of the importance of heat as a risk factor, that could lead to indoor environments in care homes kept very warm at all times. And of course, ingrained habits and practices of carers and residents. Again, the social care sector has been negatively affected, especially post-pandemic, and that might lead to lack of time, lack of resources, and generally an inflexibility to adapt those existing routines, those very busy routines, to deal with short-term shocks such as heat waves, in order to reduce health risks. Next slide, please. So these are some results from the Climate Care project, the result of hydrothermal monitoring carried out in 47 care homes. So it was found that almost half of the monitored bedrooms overheated based on existing CIP-CTM 59 criteria. And again, in some ways, resonating results that we see on overheating in housing. Urban and more recently built or converted care homes or top floor bedrooms were more prone to overheating risk. Next slide, please. And further modeling work of these, some of these pilot case study care homes found that a combination of passive interventions, including nighttime ventilation, might be required to maintain thermal comfort indoors. And this, as I was saying earlier, even if it doesn't fully mitigate the risk of overheating, we found that under a 2080s high emissions climate change scenario, you wouldn't be able, there are some technical physical limits to the effectiveness of passive cooling strategies, but they could still either delay the need to install air conditioning or overall reduce associated cooling loads and operational costs. And I think that's really important when you have such a stretched sector, such as the social care sector, that you reduce those operational costs. And other measures we tested were external shading, again found to be quite effective. There was an additional cost-benefit analysis study that found that those measures were still effective even under scenarios assuming the shortest loss of life expectancy. And we concluded that there's still a very important complement to operational responses. Next slide, please. So in addition to this work, as I said, I have begun that collaboration with colleagues at UCL, neurologists, and Epilepsy Society. So this is a work that two of our MSc students carried out, and included hygrothermal monitoring, a questionnaire survey of the staff, the frontline care staff, and also dynamic thermal modeling. So this really gave us insights into the heat management practices in these environments for people with neurological conditions. So there is generally an understanding that the residents of that center, they tend to be much more sensitive to heat, but primarily the carers or the people where they could, they primarily relied on natural ventilation strategies to reduce overheating indoors during a heat wave, but this was found as not effective enough. Next slide, please. So modeling work that we did indicate that, again, night ventilation was the most effective individual strategy. But in terms of combining strategies, in terms of looking at the cumulative impact of lots of strategies, passive strategies working together, we found that a combination of shading, ventilation, more advanced glazing, and high albedo materials could be quite effective. Similarly to the work for the main climate care sample of care homes, we found that these strategies had limits. So for some of the future more extreme climate change scenarios, they wouldn't fully maintain indoor thermal comfort, but it could still help reduce indoor temperatures, possibly reduce the time needed to operate air conditioning systems, and they could be considered in the context of hybrid cooling systems. Next slide, please. And last, I would like to talk about schools. So I recently led an EPSRC funding project called Aspire that looked at the climate resilience and indoor air quality in school buildings in the UK. So why do we need to study schools? Well, for a number of reasons. In the UK, they're responsible for around 15% of the country's public sector carbon emissions. Again, the energy costs are a significant part of a school's budget, so there is a significant need to reduce it. And also, in some ways, due to its unique characteristics, the school building sector presents a lot of opportunities for energy use reduction. For example, the occupancy activities that take place there, or equipment use, that tend to be fairly homogeneous and easier to control. So many people suggest that it might be fairly easy to implement those retrofit changes. Next slide, please. And of course, at the same time, good indoor environmental quality is fundamental for learning performance. There are strong established relationships between temperature, ventilation rates, and performance. So we know that younger people, kids, have a limited ability to thermoregulate, so they can be negatively affected by high temperatures. Again, they tend to breathe more air, so the high levels of CO2, excess temperatures can negatively affect their learning performance. And what I think is also interesting is the inequalities dimension when we look at school building performance. It's been found that children living or attending schools near high traffic density roads in urban environments are exposed to higher levels of traffic-related pollutants. And this could potentially lead to higher prevalence of asthma or other negative health impacts. And at the same time, schools in more deprived areas with less resources to adapt to warmer weather might face disruptions, for example, school closures during hot spells. And this could potentially lead to inequalities further down the line due to limited reductions in educational attainment, etc. Next slide, please. So in the Aspire project, we found that a range of retrofit and passive cooling measures again can have significant co-benefits for learning performance, educational attainment, health, and well-being. I'm mindful of the time, so I'll just go through this quickly. But Again, a similar pattern, night ventilation overhangs were found to be especially effective, although again, active cooling might be required towards the 2080s or under more extreme emission scenarios. Next slide, please. And this is part of a multi-criteria decision analysis framework that was developed in the context of this project. And what we found was that stakeholder groups ranked different performance criteria differently, although there was overall agreement. The learning performance, education attainment is the primary goal. And what we found was with the current range of interventions that we were testing, there was almost a preference for less energy efficient options, but increased ventilation rates because these were linked with higher learning performance. Again, we only test a limited number of scenarios, but I think it's really important, again, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and the energy retrofit should go hand in hand with strategies aiming to improve indoor environmental quality. Next slide. So I'd like to just finish this talk. I can see a few questions coming there with just a few thoughts in terms of what we should be prioritizing as built environment researchers, practitioners, decision makers. So I think that effective mitigation of risk requires increased awareness, public awareness about the importance of indoor environmental exposures. So I talked a lot about thermal comfort overheating, air pollutants, but there are also other factors such as daylight access or noise that can have significant impacts on our health. Development of appropriate regulatory frameworks and incentives, and the incorporation of climate resilience, both in new designs and retrofits, but also looking at the urban scale and the indoor-outdoor continuum. And importantly, a cultural shift in perceptions of heat and adaptation approaches. So there are a lot of actors that can contribute to better indoor environments and improved health and well-being, and a low zero carbon future. And I think we have to think at this point in time about the cost of action now versus the cost of inaction. And one last slide, please. So yeah, last I would like to mention the two MSc programs I'm involved in at the UCL IED. So there is MSc Environmental Design Engineering, a well-established course, a pioneering course, I would say, dealing with the reduction of carbon emissions and the creation of sustainable buildings for several decades. I'm lucky enough to be one of the graduates and now teach on the program. Our MSc Health, Wellbeing and Sustainable Buildings, which we launched back in 2017 with Dr. Marcella Ucci, addressing the need to also look at the health and well-being dimensions of our decisions, design decisions in the built environment, and also the Smart Buildings and Digital Engineering MSc, looking at innovative solutions and novel research in this area. And I guess a common thread that runs through all of these programs is the focus on integrated and interdisciplinary design. So next slide, I think that's my last one. So I think we might have a few minutes for questions. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again so much to Bethania for inviting me. This is my email address and my Twitter. I think it's called X now. So if I don't manage to answer any questions or you have any thoughts about the presentation, please do get in touch after the presentation. And sorry, Bethania, it took a bit longer than expected.
No problem, no problem. It was so interesting. I didn't want to interrupt you. So we'll have time maybe for a few questions, but the questions, we can share them later. You can comment them in the chat. So no problem with that. So thank you very much. It was a really interesting presentation. Excellent. All the points that you touched and the holistic view of this complex problem that, as you might be showing, it's not tackled entirely at the moment. Maybe because it's multifactorial, maybe because it's emerging, some areas are emerging maybe because too many people need to be involved. Why do you think it is that this is like in early stages, or it seems?
Yeah, so I think it has to do a lot with disciplinary fragmentation. So even within our field, we have different groups of researchers working on thermal comfort, different people working on moisture analysis, and so on. So I think it's the fact that we have different disciplines, and that's both in research, in academia, and in industry. So we need more interdisciplinary collaboration, more communication, developing a shared vocabulary. And
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
I think that's kind of my answer to the first question by Tom. Hi, Tom. Uh,
Yes, good
how,
that you're here.
how did you become interested in climate adaptive future-proof buildings? So yeah, I could share a bit about my personal journey. So I studied architecture engineering in Greece, in Athens, and I think increasingly I was getting a bit frustrated by the fact that during my undergraduate studies, we weren't really collaborating with other disciplines, such as civil mechanical engineers. And there was a lack of consideration of, climate responsive strategies, very little about the need to adapt to climate change. So I guess it was my personal interest um, on these aspects that led me to do an MSc in environmental design and engineering. I remember designing buildings with, huge glazed facades for, the center of Athens, right in the center of the Athens urban heat island with no shading. And I
Probably
remember,
one of the most hot cities in Europe, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. I think, yeah, a very high heat island intensity, and I remember thinking at the time that just can't be right, and I need to do something about it, or educate myself further to become a better professional. And I guess I ended up in academia.
Yes. Yeah, it sounds a bit familiar. Yeah, I know what you mean. I had same background in
Yeah.
architecture and then ended
Yeah.
up being a graduate from this course. So yeah, it was great. Um, well, I might do another question. How do you see the promotion of lightweight construction systems as a
Mm,
solution to reduce operational and embodied carbon in buildings like timber, since
mm,
they imply a reduction on thermal inertia with
mm.
considerable consequences on energy demand for cooling, particularly in countries with warm climates?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So generally, I think we should think about the climate context before we propose any solution. So we know that thermal mass is proposed as a potential solution for cooling, but it's usually advised for hot and dry climates combined with night cooling strategies. It's really important. And again, there are implications for embodied carbon, structure considerations. So I think there is place for lightweight construction systems, possibly for more hot and humid climate contexts. Again, this is where we need the expertise and tools such as dynamic thermal simulation, for example, to fully quantify the impacts of the different strategies. Um, and again, I think there is more that could be done on looking as we reduce operational energy and carbon, looking at the associated embodied energy and carbon of any systems, construction materials, any solutions that we propose.
Thank you. And this is one question I have. So, are you aware of any public health initiatives, maybe in London or in any other place, which are at the moment helping mitigate these issues that you were discussing related to buildings or these type of buildings and the vulnerable populations?
So there are some great initiatives by the Greater London Authority, mapping cool spaces across London. There are lots of research projects out there and funding calls. But again, I think it's really important that we all try to work holistically. And sometimes the focus tends to be on temperature, or another project looks at air pollutants, and we don't talk to each other, which I think is really, really, it's a missed opportunity.
And how do you, at the moment, tackle that? lack no, but difficulty with collaboration, or how
Um,
do you deal with that at the
I have to
moment?
admit, it's not always easy, and I think it's because, on the one hand, because we might not have the same terminology. Um, for example, I work with public health professionals, epidemiologists, and so on, social scientists, and we might not all share the vocabulary. So I think you need to put the work into this. I have colleagues who specialize in facilitating. Um,
That's
this
great.
kind of interactions through a systems thinking approach, and I find that really helpful. Um, and yeah, also in some ways we tend to be limited, constrained by the tools we have. So for building performance analysis, we might have different tools for hygrothermal simulation and different ones for acoustic performance. So I think that's another area where, again, we need more collaboration and more integrated thinking.
Good. Thank you. We hopefully see that in the coming years. And I have a last question. I mean, we ended up here. The rest of the questions will be posted. How can passive design strategies like external shutters that you mentioned are incorporated in cities like London, where planning requirements might prevent the use of them for aesthetic reasons, especially in protected buildings and areas?
Yeah, so that's a significant issue. The other potential problem is that a lot of windows in UK homes open outwards, so you have a clash between the ventilation and the shading system. So yeah, these are all known limitations, listed buildings, etc. There will be many cases where external shading is not feasible. Um, However, I still think that there are other passive cooling options that could still be adopted, and to some degree, we found through a recent modeling work study that we did that internal shading, it might not be as effective as external, but it could still have some benefits in terms of mitigating overheating. So it's worth installing, and with less requirements when it comes to planning and getting permission and so on. And yeah.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Anna, for
Thank
this
you.
amazing
I'm sorry
presentation.
I didn't manage to answer all the questions. I think there are a couple more, but
There are plenty of questions, so you can go through if you want to. And well, thank you for all the questions. And as usual, this session will be posted online, which is very helpful because there's a lot to digest. And so check out our website, shareyourgreendesign.com, and subscribe to our channels to keep up with this and other content that we are constantly sharing, such as the latest projects, news, research, events, competition, student work, and job adverts. If you have projects or research that you want to share on our platform, please get in touch with us. And if you have any comments, ideas, or just want to collaborate, please get in touch as well. Thank you, everyone, and see you
thank
again soon.
thank
Thank
you.
you, Anna.